Okay guys, so welcome back to my YouTube channel. So for today's video, we will discuss the continuation of cost accounting and control introduction, wherein the focus of the discussion will be the cost accumulation under normal costing. So let's start. Okay, so before we proceed to the actual discussion of normal costing, so let's first discuss the three cost accumulation, which is part doon si normal costing. So as we all know, one of the objectives of cost accounting is to properly determine, accumulate, and record the cost of a manufacturing concern or manufacturing business. It's either by total or by product, because this amount will be used as a basis for us to properly price the product. Kasi kung magkano yung selling price natin, dapat malalaman muna natin yung ating cost before we put a selling price to that. Kasi as we all know, under our market, we cannot price the product too high and we cannot also price the product too low. So if we say pricing the product too high, ang mangyayari kasi niyan, although the product is effective, if mataas naman yung ating selling price, wala ring bibili sa atin. So masasayang lang yung pinaghirapan ng management. And also, we cannot price the product too low kasi although mababa dadami ang ating market, ang magiging effect naman yan, mag-i-incur tayo ng losses kasi aside from the product cost, meron pa tayong period cost na i-incur. So that's why napaka-importante po ng cost accumulation method na gagamitin ng management in order to properly determine the selling price of the product. So under cost accounting, we have three kinds of that. So yung number one, meron tayong tinatawag na actual costing. So yung actual costing, ito na po yung alam natin from the beginning, wherein everything is recorded at actual cost. So under actual costing, the actual cost is the realized cost and is not based on estimate. So, and it also supports financial accounting. So under actual costing, so everything is recorded at actual cost, and normally this is recorded at the end or after the cost has been incurred. So kapag na-incur na yung obligation, nire-record natin yan kung magkano yung ating cash out or kaya naman yung amount na related to that at actual costing. So under cost accounting, so meron tayong, ang alam natin, meron tayong manufacturing cost. So yung direct materials natin, nire-record natin yan ng actual cost. So kailangan muna nating ma-incur or ma-issue sa production kung magkano yung amount na yon at actual cost, i-record natin yan, direct materials. The same thing with direct labor, actual cost din yan, and also the factory overhead at actual cost. So actually, actual costing supports the accounting principle of accuracy because dahil nga actual cost natin sila nire-record, so ibig sabihin, sigurado tayo na ayan talaga yung product cost ng isang product. Okay? So meron tayong pangalawa na cost accumulation na pwedeng gamitin ng management. Ito yung tinatawag po nating standard costing. So ang standard costing, meron po yung separate discussion sa ating course. I-discuss natin yan pag dumating na yan, pero bibigyan ko lang kayo ng overview how standard costing works. So if we say standard costing from the word itself, from the word standard, so lumalabas, before the production happens, so meron na po tayong mga predetermined amount. So, di ba, pamilyar naman kayo sa word na standard. If we say standard, it is a benchmark or guide ng management in order for them to properly cost the product. So sa pang-araw-araw nating buhay, pag sinabi nating standard, so let's say sleeping hours, 'di ba? So ang standard sleeping hours ng tao ay 8 hours. Kapag sumobra ka, ibig sabihin, you go beyond the standard kapag kumulang ka naman ng tulog. So ano ka naman, lesser ka naman sa standard. So under cost accounting, ganun din po ang ating approach niyan. So maganda kasi yung standard costing. Bakit? Kasi before the production happens, meron na agad tayong amount na ilalagay sa ating manufacturing cost. So under standard costing, it refers to the estimated cost of a product pertaining to material, labor, and factory overhead. So lumalabas, it also supports management accounting. So lumalabas yung ating manufacturing cost, nire-record po natin yan at standard cost. So bakit standard cost? Because ginagamit ang standard cost para before the production happens, meron na agad tayong price ng product. So makakapag-price na tayo agad ng ating produkto agad-agad kasi meron na tayong predetermined amount. And it supports timeliness kasi dahil nga yung figures natin ay meron na before the production happens. So ibig sabihin yung reporting natin ay mabilis. So kapag kailangan ng management ng manufacturing cost for a certain product, even if the product is not yet hindi pa siya nagsisimulang gawin, automatic meron na po tayong amount na ilalagay. Kasi nga, under standard costing, before the production happens, meron na tayong standard cost niyan. So later, ibibigyan ko kayo ng overview how to compute the standard cost per manufacturing cost natin. So kung mapapansin nyo, meron pong advantage and disadvantages pag ginamit natin si actual costing kaysa sa standard costing and standard costing kaysa kay actual costing. Kasi if we use fully the actual costing, although nag-a-adhere tayo sa accuracy, ang problema kasi natin sa actual costing, kailangan pang matapos yung production at kailangan pa nating antayin yung actual costing before tayo magkaroon ng manufacturing cost. So, although na-achieve natin yung accuracy, nagkakaroon naman tayo ng problema with regards sa timeliness. Kasi at the end of the day, our goal is to properly price the product at para magkaroon na ng selling price, yung produkto natin na ibibenta naman natin sa ating mga customer. So, kung late dadating, kung kailangan pang matapos yung production bago tayo magkakaroon ng product cost, at doon pa lang tayo gagawa ng pricing natin, baka madelay yung ating selling process. So, ayun po yung disadvantage ng actual costing. Although, accurate yung information kasi recorded yan ng actual cost, ang problema, hindi timely yung ating reporting. So, standard costing naman, although na-achieve natin si timeliness, kasi nga kapag kailangan natin ng price ng manufacturing cost per product, nandiyan na agad siya, ang problema naman, hindi accurate kinukuha nating information kasi everything is based on the predetermined amount. So, kung mapapansin nyo, yung kulang ng isa ay advantage naman ng isa. Kaya po nabuo yung tinatawag po natin na normal costing. So, under normal costing, so na-clear niya po yung defect ng accuracy tsaka ng timeliness. Yung defect ni actual costing sa timeliness, yung defect ni standard costing sa accuracy. So, basically, under normal costing, yung manufacturing cost po natin is a combination of actual costing and standard costing. So lumalabas under normal costing if the product is direct cost or if the cost can be directly or traceable to the product. So gagamit po tayo ng actual cost. Alam naman natin kung ano yung mga direct cost natin. So meron tayong prime cost which is direct materials and direct labor. Then yung factory overhead, dahil alam naman natin these are indirect cost which is mahirap yan i-allocate. So lumalabas ito kasi nagiging ano natin tawag dito, ito yung nagiging problema ng standard costing or ng actual costing. Kasi ang factory overhead, dahil indirect cost yan, so hindi natin malalaman agad-agad kung magkano yung amount dedicated to a certain product. Kasi nga, kailangan pa natin malaman kung magkano ba yung actual consumption ng product na ito. Kung magkano yung electricity involved, ilan yung consumption nila, ilang mga workers, how many hours. So ngayon, na-cure ng defect ng normal cost, ang sinasabi ng normal costing, so hindi na natin kailangang antayin pa yung actual costing ng factory overhead kasi we can use the standard cost. So lumalabas, as per accuracy, so since available naman ang data ng direct materials at direct labor, dahil direct naman sila, so once incurred, pwede na natin silang gamitin as our cost dun sa ating product. So with regard naman sa timeliness, so dahil hindi natin kayang antayin yung actual factory cost per product, dahil marami pang allocation method ang gagamitin, so pwede na po natin gamitin si standard costing. So under IFRS and under generally accepted accounting principles, normal costing is allowed. So ibig sabihin, pwede po natin gamitin ang direct materials at actual cost, direct labor at actual cost, then yung factory overhead naman, gagamitin natin yan at standard cost. Okay, so let's talk about normal costing. As I mentioned earlier, under normal costing, ang ating direct labor and ang ating direct materials are recorded under actual and yung ating factory overhead are recorded under standard costing. So I forgot to mention earlier that one of the benefits of using normal costing specific to factory overhead, which ang ginagamit natin ay standard costing, is yung na-achieve natin yung accounting principle na uniformity of reporting. Kasi there are some cases na ang management, so alam naman natin ang composition ng factory overhead ay meron yang variable and meron yang fixed. So alam naman natin, ang variable wala tayong problema yan kasi regardless kung ano yung number activity level, yung per unit natin ay parehas lamang. However, if you're talking about the fixed cost, so kapag mas marami yung activity level natin, of course, lumiliit yung ating fixed cost per unit. Kapag onti naman ang ating activity, so dumadami ang ating fixed or lumalaki ang ating fixed cost per unit. So para magkaroon ng uniformity of reporting, at the same time, gagamitin din kasi ng management for their decision-making process. Kaya mas maganda na gamitin sa factory overhead is yung standard costing para uniform yung ating factory overhead per unit. So before we proceed dun sa kung paano i-compute yung ating mga costing under normal costing, so we need first to familiarize ourselves with these two important terms. So yung una, meron tayong cost. So alam naman natin yan. So cost is the value of money that has been used up to produce something to deliver a service. At the same time, kailangan maging familiar din tayo dito sa concept ng cost driver. So according to cost accounting, cost driver is a unit of an activity that causes the change in activities of cost. So in layman's term, if we say cost driver, so basically it drives the cost. So sa ating manufacturing cost, which is meron tayong direct materials and we also have direct labor and factory overhead. So we had to determine what is the cost and what is the cost driver. As I mentioned earlier, yung cost, alam naman natin yan kung magkano yung ating actual incurrence. So meron tayong direct materials cost, direct labor cost, and we have the factory overhead cost. So ngayon, ang kailangan po nating malaman is yung cost driver. As I mentioned earlier, cost driver, it is something that drives the cost or it is a unit of activity that causes the change in activities cost. So under direct materials, ang cost natin dyan, of course, is a direct materials cost. So ano naman yung ating cost driver? So ang cost driver natin dyan is any unit of measurement such as meters, yards, liters, inches, and etc. So, under direct labor, alam naman natin, ang ating cost dyan is yung direct labor cost. So, ang ating cost driver dyan is labor hours. So, as you can see, kaya siya tinawag na cost driver is that the more hours or labor hours, the more the direct labor cost will be incurred by the entity or by the manufacturing business. At the same time, doon din sa direct materials, kung mapapansin nyo, kapag mas maraming nagamit na meters, yards, liters, inches, etc., ang manufacturing concern, mas malaki yung ating materials cost. Kaya importante malaman natin kung ano yung nagda-drive ng cost. So which is sa direct materials, kung ano yung unit of measurement. Sa direct labor naman, kung ilang hours yung na-dedicate ng laborer natin sa pag-produce ng product. So sa factory overhead, medyo complicated ang ating cost drivers kasi alam naman natin, factory overhead are indirect costs. So dahil indirect cost ang factory overhead, napakaraming cost driver na pwede nating maisip, di ba? So ang cost driver niyan, pwede po yung machine hours, pwede yung kilowatt na nagamit ng factory, so para ma-determine yung ating utilities expense. Pwede rin naman yung number of employees kasi kapag meron tayo mga indirect laborers such as yung mga factory janitors or kaya naman yung ating mga supervisors. Then pwede rin naman natin gamitin yung labor hours dedicated dun sa ating mga indirect laborers. So however, under traditional costing, so kailangan lang po humanap ni management ng isang pinakamalapit or kumbaga fits all na cost driver para sa lahat para mas madali yung ating pagkuha ng ating factory overhead per unit. So ngayon, pag-iisipin mo, ano ba yung pinaka-related dun sa pag-produce ng product na cost driver under factory overhead? So most of the problem ng ating exam, ang ginagamit po dyan is yung labor hours kasi based on their logic, kapag mas madami yung na-dedicate ng management na labor hours, so mas malaki din ang chance na magka-incur ng malaking factory overhead. Let's say for example, kapag ang isang direct laborers ay nag-overtime, of course, kailangan niya ng enough time para makapag-produce ng additional product. So, kailangan niya gumamit ng electricity. So, ibig sabihin, so pwede nating sabihin na yung electricity ay directly related dun sa labor hours. Same time with machine, di ba? Kasi kapag nag-extend ng labor hours ang ating mga direct laborers, so malamang kailangan natin buksan yung ating machine. Kaya pwede yung management gumagamit sila ng direct labor hours as their cost driver. So under traditional costing, which is our topic for this video, ang most na ginagamit ng ating mga management o ng ating factory is yung ating direct labor hours So, mamaya i-discuss natin paano yan i-compute. Okay, as a recap, under normal costing, charge natin ang manufacturing cost na direct materials and direct labor based on the actual cost per unit ng ating product. Then, ang nag-iiba lang sa normal costing is yung factory overhead kasi charge natin to sa production based on the standard cost. So, paano ba natin hinahanap yung rate or yung amount na ginagamit natin sa pag-apply ng factory overhead sa ating production? So, under factory overhead, gumagamit tayo ng standard cost. So, vital na malaman natin yung predetermined amount, kaya diniscuss natin kanina yung cost tsaka yung cost driver. So, normally, in order to determine the predetermined rate, ang ginagamit po nating basis dyan is yung number 1 is yung percentage of direct labor cost. So, ito yung pinakamadaling paraan kasi based on the logic, kapag mas malaki daw ang direct labor cost, lumalaki din yung manufacturing overhead kasi meron silang relationship na dalawa. Kasi example niyan, kapag mas marami daw ang laborer, of course, marami yung ating indirect laborer. At the same time, kapag mas maraming direct labor hours ang na-dedicate sa isang task, so dumalaki din ang utilities expense ng isang factory. Kaya normally, ang ginagamit po na cost driver is yung direct labor cost. So if we use the percentage of direct labor cost, normally ito po yung sinasabi sa problem. So the factory overhead is applied at the rate of 20% of direct labor. So depende po yan sa management prerogative based on the past performance. So pwede yung 30%, 50%, 100%, 200%. Basta ang sinasabi lang dito, kung magkano ang direct labor cost, that will be the basis in order to apply the factory overhead. Okay, so another way to determine the predetermined rate or the predetermined amount is to compute for the predetermined amount using this formula. So, kinukuha muna natin yung budgeted factory overhead. Pwede yung per year or pwede rin yung per month. Then, dinidivide natin yung sa budgeted cost driver or budgeted activity. So, if we say budgeted factory overhead, ito po yung na-estimate ng management na mai-incur na factory overhead for the year based on their estimates, based on their target or kaya naman based sa past performance. Then, yung budgeted cost driver naman, it depends on how many cost driver or how many activity levels will be dedicated to produce a specific product. So, ang madalas na ginagamit po na cost driver is yung ating direct labor hours. Kasi nga, as I mentioned earlier, ito yung pinakamalapit na cost driver para sa lahat. Kaya under traditional costing, most of the time, ginagamit yung direct labor hours as a cost driver. So, let's have an illustration kung paano yan ina-analyze. So let's say the management forecasted that the factory overhead will cost 4 million pesos next year and the budgeted direct labor hours will be 80,000 direct labor hours. So in this case, kailangan lang muna natin ilatag yung ating formula wherein the budgeted factory overhead for the year will be 4 million pesos and the budgeted direct labor hours for the year will be 80,000 direct labor hours. So pag kinuha natin yung sagot niyan, 4 million divided by 80,000 direct labor hours, we can say that the factory overhead is applied at 50% per direct labor hours. So basically, nakadependent yan dun sa ating direct labor kasi kung ilan ang direct labor na nagamit sa pag-produce ng product, so gagamitin din po natin yun para malaman natin kung magkano yung i-apply natin sa factory overhead for that specific product. Okay, so let's now proceed to the accounting of normal costing under application of manufacturing costs. So under application of manufacturing costs, as I mentioned earlier, so yung ating manufacturing cost na direct materials will be charged to production at actual cost, and the direct labor will also charge at actual cost, and the factory overhead will be charged at standard cost. So dito pag-usapan na natin yung journal entries involved, di ba? Under direct materials, the application of direct materials to production is we just need to debit work in process, then credit raw materials. Kasi nga, sined na natin yung sa production. So therefore, we have to debit work in process, then credit raw materials inventory. So on the other hand, under direct labor cost, i-send lang din natin sa production at actual cost. So ang unang entry natin yan, of course, the incurrence of the direct labor. So debit ka ng payroll, tapos credit ka ng accrued payroll. Pero on the allocation, which is the application of direct labor to production, this should be the entry. So debit ka ng work in process, then credit ka ng payroll to eliminate the account. Diba? Then under factory overhead, we have to consider two journal entries kasi nga, we're using standard cost. Kaya kanina, kinompute natin or diniscuss natin kung paano yung pag-compute ng predetermined amount tsaka yung predetermined rate kasi that will be used in order to apply the factory overhead to production. So, gagamit tayo ng predetermined rate. So, that's why the pro forma journal entry upon application of the factory overhead to production will be debit work in process, then credit factory overhead applied. So, ginagamit po natin yung factory overhead applied kasi wala pa naman tayong actual costing at kailangan na nating mag-apply sa production kasi kailangan na tayong makuha yung cost per product para makumpleto natin yung manufacturing cost. However, under accounting standards, hindi naman pwedeng mag-rely na lang tayo sa factory overhead applied kasi nga estimate lang yan. At the end of the day, ang i-record natin is actual cost kaya kailangan pa rin nating i-recognize yung ating factory overhead once incurred. So, ibig sabihin, sa maraming factory overhead na yan, i-record pa rin natin yan sa ating libro. So, una, mag-record tayo ng factory overhead applied. Ito yung ina-apply natin sa production yung factory overhead using the predetermined rate. And number two, recording of the incurrence ng ating actual factory overhead. So, this is the pro forma entry upon the incurrence. So, marami po tayong possible na credit, pero mag-debit ka lang ng factory overhead control. So, factory overhead control yung ginagamit kasi ang assumption is gagawa tayo ng schedule for all the manufacturing costs incurred in the production. So, let's say for example, indirect materials, indirect labor, utilities expense, or kaya naman depreciation expense. So, instead of detailing those information, ang i-record lang natin sa libro is yung factory overhead control. Magkakaroon na lang tayo ng schedule kung ano-ano yung mga nakalista doon. So, however, ilalagay natin sa credit side yung mga related na ka-partner nila. So, pwede tayo maglagay dyan ng accounts payable. Let's say, for example, yung utilities payable ay hindi pa bayad. So, credit tayo ng cash. Let's say, for example, other expenses yan, yung mga insurance expenses. Then, pwede rin tayo mag-credit ng accumulated depreciation. Let's say, for example, depreciation ng equipment ng factory. So, instead of debiting depreciation expense, then credit accumulated depreciation, the entry should be factory overhead control, then credit accumulated depreciation. So once we already have the balance or the amount of the factory overhead applied and the factory overhead control, so kailangan po natin yang i-analyze kung tama ba yung apply natin dun sa production in the first place. Kasi at the end of the day, ang i-record po natin si actual cost. So, based on this slide, so ang ating assumption lang po, yung difference between the factory overhead applied and the factory overhead control is immaterial. So, anything will be or everything will be recorded under cost of goods sold. So, hindi na po natin yung isasama sa work in process kasi nga, nagkaroon na tayo ng factory overhead applied. So, para makuha niyan, bibigyan ko kayo ng two ways how to analyze kung meron tayong over application or under application at kung paano natin yan i-effect sa ating accounting books. So, pwede tayong gumamit ng key account. So, yung factory overhead account. So, sa credit side, ilalagay lang natin dyan yung applied kasi based dun sa ating pro forma entry, kapag nag-a-apply tayo ng factory overhead, nagkikredit tayo ng factory overhead applied. So, yung actual incurrence naman, so based dun sa ating second entry under factory overhead, nagde-debit naman tayo ng factory overhead control. So, debit, actual factory overhead control. So, as you can see, kapag hindi po parehas si actual at si applied, kailangan po nating alamin ano ba yung variances nila, over-applied ba yan or under-applied. So yung number one, kapag daw si applied ay mas mataas kaysa sa actual or kaya naman the actual costing is less than the applied factory overhead, so lumalabas tayo po ay under-applied, tama ba? So dahil under-applied po tayo, so ibig sabihin, kailangan po nating habulin, ang sagot pala dito ay over-applied kasi mas mataas yung apply natin ng factory overhead kaysa sa actual incurrence natin. So, ibig sabihin, dahil tayo over-applied, so kailangan po nating bawasan si factory overhead kasi ang goal natin is habulin si actual factory overhead. As I mentioned earlier, ang mag-a-adjust po dyan si cost of goods sold. Kapag may over-application, so nakalagay dyan kulay green kasi maganda yan sa management kasi the cost of goods sold will be reduced. So, dahil babawasan natin yung cost of goods sold, so ang normal balance nun ay debit, so i-credit natin siya. So, debit ka lang ng factory overhead applied, then credit ka ng cost of goods sold. On the other hand, if the actual cost is more than the applied factory overhead, so lumalabas po, meron tayong under-applied. So, under-applied po yung tawag kasi kinulang tayo ng pag-apply ng factory overhead. So, mas marami pala yung actual cost kaysa dun sa in-expect nating under-applied. So, ibig sabihin, kailangan po natin yung habulin yung actual costing natin. So, sa case natin, kung mapapansin nyo, kulay red yan kasi it will add to the our cost of goods sold kasi kailangan nating habulin yung actual cost. So, para habulin yan, so ganun lang ulit, magde-debit tayo ng cost of goods sold, tapos makikredit kayo ng factory overhead applied. So, kung hindi nyo siya mag-get sa ganung klaseng analysis, so pwede naman siyang yung conventional. So, gamitan natin ng logic. So, ito yung ating logic natin. So, if the actual cost is more than the applied cost, so meron po tayong tinatawag na under-applied. So, under-applied kasi kulang yung actual cost na in-apply natin, kulang yung applied cost na in-apply natin kaysa dun sa actual cost. Kasi hahapulin natin si actual cost natin. So, actual factory overhead. On the other hand, if the actual cost is less than the applied cost, so lumalabas, sumobra naman tayo ng pag-apply ng factory overhead. So, dahil sumobra tayo ng apply ng factory overhead, so bawasan natin. So, pag binawasan natin, so debit ka lang ulit ng factory overhead applied, then credit ka ng cost of goods sold.